His name was Julian, and for 347 nights, he was a ghost. A whisper of movement in my peripheral vision, a solid shape in the grainy security monitors above my desk. He was the night watchman, the guardian of the quiet, echoing halls of the Atherton Museum archives, and I was just another piece of the collection he was paid to protect. My life had become a study in stillness. I was an acquisitions cataloger, a title that sounded far more adventurous than the reality. The reality was a small, climate-controlled office in the sub-basement, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's lives. Acid-free boxes of letters, forgotten photographs, the brittle diaries of long-dead socialites. I spent my nights under the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, translating the past into searchable data, my only companions the low thrum of the servers and the scent of old paper and dust. Loneliness wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a dull, constant pressure, a room I had lived in for so long I had forgotten the windows could open. I observed the world from behind glass. The glass of my office window looking out onto an empty corridor, the glass of my apartment window looking out onto a city that moved on without me, the digital glass of the monitor that showed me Julian making his rounds. He was a creature of routine, just like me. At 11:05 p.m., his form would cross the camera feed for hallway C. At 1:17 a.m., a brief flicker of his flashlight would bounce off the polished marble in the main rotunda. At 3:42 a.m., he would pass my section, a dark, broad-shouldered silhouette against the emergency lighting at the far end of the hall. We never spoke. We existed in parallel, two solitary planets orbiting the same silent sun of the archive. I knew things about him, the way a prisoner knows the patterns of his guard. I knew he favored his left leg slightly, a barely perceptible dip in his otherwise steady, measured gait. I knew he drank his coffee black from a dented silver thermos he'd place on the security console. I knew the way the crisp fabric of his uniform strained across his back when he leaned over to check a door lock. These were my secrets, hoarded observations that felt illicit and precious in their triviality. He was a puzzle of quiet competence, a physical fact in my world of abstract information. In the dead hours of the night, when the city outside was finally asleep, my mind would drift from 19th century shipping manifests to the simple, solid presence of the man walking the halls above me. He was, in a word, my unrequited crush, a fiction I had built out of silence and distance. Then, on the 348th night, the routine broke. It wasn't a sudden shatter, but a quiet crack in the foundation of my solitude. The change was so small I almost missed it. At 3:42 a.m., his silhouette appeared at the end of the hall, as always. But instead of passing by, it stopped. It turned. It moved toward my glass-walled office. My fingers froze over my keyboard. My breath caught in my throat, a sudden, sharp snag. This had never happened before. He stopped just outside the door, his form filling the frame. For a long moment, he just stood there, his face obscured by the glare on the glass. Then, he raised a hand and gave a short, two-fingered wave. A simple acknowledgement. A greeting. I was so startled that I could only manage a weak, jerky nod in return before he continued on his way, his footsteps receding down the corridor. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. A wave. It was nothing. It was everything. It was a deviation in the data, an anomaly in the code of my quiet life. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't focus. The words on the page blurred. The hum of the servers seemed louder, more intrusive. Every creak of the building was him coming back. Every shadow was his shape. The interaction had been less than 5 seconds long, but it had rewired the entire night. He had seen me, not just as a light on in a basement office, but as a person. Me, Leo. And in that moment, the ghost I had been watching for almost a year had turned, and for the first time, I felt like he was watching me back. The next night, I was a wreck of anticipation. I found myself checking the clock constantly, my stomach twisting into a nervous knot as 3:42 a.m. approached. I tried to pretend I was working, my eyes scanning a document about antique lace patterns, but my senses were stretched taut, listening. The air in my office felt thick, charged. I smoothed down my hair, a gesture so absurdly hopeful it made my cheeks burn. I adjusted my posture, sitting up straighter. And then I saw him. The silhouette at the end of the hall. He stopped. He turned. He walked toward me. This time, he didn't stop outside. He paused, then pushed the door open a few inches. The sterile, conditioned air of my office was suddenly invaded by a new scent, something clean and cool like night air and a faint, subtle trace of sandalwood. Everything quiet down here. His voice was exactly as I had imagined it, yet entirely new. It was a low, calm rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It held a texture that the tinny speakers of the security system could never capture. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Always, I managed to reply, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison. He nodded, his eyes scanning the office. They were dark, I could see that now. Deep-set and steady. His gaze didn't linger on the stacks of boxes or the blinking computer screens. It landed on me. It was an unreadable look. Not friendly, not unfriendly. Just observant. "All right then," he said, and it felt like a complete conversation. He gave another one of his small, almost imperceptible nods. "Have a good night." He pulled the door shut, the latch clicking softly into place. And just like that, he was gone. The corridor was empty again, but the space he had occupied still hummed with his presence. The scent of sandalwood lingered in the air. I leaned back in my chair, my body feeling strangely weak, my mind racing. He had spoken to me. He had a voice. He had a scent. The abstract fiction was rapidly, terrifyingly, becoming a concrete reality. This small, two-sentence exchange was the catalyst. It was the inciting incident in a story I hadn't even realized had begun. My quiet, ordered world of observation was over. A new era of interaction had just dawned, and I was completely, utterly unprepared for it. The nightly check-ins became our new routine. It was the anchor of my shift, the single point of light in an 8-hour stretch of quiet monotony. At first, the conversations were as sparse as his first one. A simple all quiet from him, a yes, all good from me. But slowly, tentatively, they began to expand. He started leaning against the doorframe, one arm braced high, a posture that was casual but also commanding. It made the small space of my doorway feel entirely his. He'd ask what I was working on, and I'd explain, my words tumbling out in a rush of academic jargon about provenance and preservation. I expected him to look bored, to glaze over, but he didn't. He listened. His dark eyes would stay fixed on my face, his expression unreadable but attentive. He had a stillness about him, a quality of absolute presence that made me feel like I was the only person in the entire building. I began to catalog him in the same way I cataloged the artifacts. Julian. Height, approximately 6'2". Hair, dark brown, cut short and neat. Eyes, the color of strong coffee, deep and difficult to read. Defining characteristics, a small, faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a habit of rubbing his thumb over the face of his practical, unadorned watch, a smile that was so rare it felt like a solar eclipse. When it did appear, it was a small, private thing, a slight upward twitch at one corner of his mouth that transformed his stoic face into something unexpectedly gentle. I saw it for the first time when I was describing a particularly bizarre collection of Victorian-era taxidermy squirrels arranged in a wedding scene. The corner of his mouth lifted, and a low chuckle rumbled in his chest. The sound hit me like a physical blow. "You're kidding me," he said, the amusement clear in his voice. "I wish I were," I replied, a genuine smile breaking across my own face. "The bride is wearing a veil made of real lace. It's my job to make sure it doesn't disintegrate." He shook his head, that ghost of a smile still playing on his lips. "Weird what people hold on to. Tell me about it," I said, and for a moment, we weren't a cataloger and a security guard. We were just two people sharing a moment of absurdity in the middle of the night. My observation of him intensified, becoming a kind of secret obsession. I watched him on the monitors with a new purpose. I wasn't just tracking his location, I was studying his movements, his posture. I learned to read the subtle shifts in his body language. A slight tensing of his shoulders meant the day shift supervisor had left a passive-aggressive note. A slower, more deliberate pace on his rounds meant he was tired. I was building a complex profile of a man based on the barest of data points, and my internal monologue was a constant stream of analysis. He paused in front of the camera in the East Wing for 10 seconds tonight, instead of the usual 5. What does that mean? Is he thinking about something? Is he thinking about me? It was madness. It was exhilarating. The scent of him became a trigger for my overthinking. That clean, sandalwood cologne was a herald of his arrival. I would catch a faint whiff of it minutes before he appeared, my body tensing in anticipation. It would cling to the air in my office long after he left, a spectral reminder of his presence. I would breathe it in, trying to isolate its components, trying to memorize it. It smelled like safety. It smelled like a quiet strength that I, in my world of brittle paper and careful movements, desperately craved. Then came the first touch. It was meaningless, accidental, and it nearly sent me into cardiac arrest. He was leaning in the doorway as usual, and I had stood up to retrieve a file from a cabinet behind my desk. The space was cramped. As I squeezed past him, the sleeve of my sweater brushed against the hard muscle of his forearm. It was a fleeting contact, lasting no more than a second, but a jolt of pure electricity shot up my arm. His skin was warm, solid, real. "Sorry," I mumbled, my face flushing hot. "You're fine," he said, his voice calm, unbothered. He hadn't even flinched. To him, it was nothing. To me, it was a seismic event. I sat back at my desk, my heart pounding, the spot on my arm where we had touched tingling with a phantom heat. My mind replayed the moment on a loop, analyzing it from every angle. He didn't pull away. He stood his ground. Was that intentional? Did he want me to touch him? The internal sarcasm kicked in, a familiar defense mechanism. Yes, Leo. He, a mountain of a man, stood there hoping your clumsy elbow would graze his magnificent bicep. Get a grip. But the rational part of my brain was losing the battle. The yearning was a rising tide, and my carefully constructed walls of detachment were beginning to crumble. The touches, small and ambiguous, began to accumulate. A few nights later, he pointed out a smudge of ink on my cheek, his finger hovering an inch from my skin before he seemed to think better of it and dropped his hand. "You've got something. Right there," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. My entire body went rigid. I scrubbed at my cheek, mortified and thrilled all at once. Another time, as he was leaving, he rested his hand on the door, and his knuckles brushed against my shoulder. Again, the contact was brief, almost certainly accidental, but it felt deliberate. It felt significant. His hand was large and warm, and the brief pressure of it through my shirt was enough to make my breath hitch. I spent the next hour trying to convince myself it was a coincidence, that the doorway was narrow, that these things just happened. But my internal analysis told a different story. The data was accumulating. The pattern was emerging. These weren't random accidents. They were tests. Small, deniable explorations of a boundary that was becoming increasingly blurry. He never overstepped. His movements were always just within the realm of plausible deniability. It was a masterful dance of ambiguity, and it was driving me slowly insane. I was caught in a state of constant, low-grade arousal and anxiety. Every night was a tightrope walk between hope and the fear of misinterpretation. Was I projecting my own desires onto a man who was just being friendly? Or was he, in his own quiet, stoic way, reaching out to me? The uncertainty was a physical weight, a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The quiet, lonely peace of my old life was gone, replaced by a turbulent, thrilling chaos. I was no longer just observing a ghost on a screen. I was interacting with a man of flesh and blood, a man whose nearness was becoming as essential to me as the air I breathed. And I had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The power outage happened on a Tuesday night in late October. A storm had been raging outside for hours, a violent tantrum of wind and rain that rattled the very bones of the old building. I was only peripherally aware of it, lost in the delicate task of photographing a series of hand-painted maps from the 18th century. The world had shrunk to the space under my bright task lamp, the smell of vellum and the intricate lines of a cartographer's pen. Then, with a sudden, definitive clunk, everything went black. The hum of the servers died. The fluorescent lights overhead blinked out. The screen on my computer faded to nothing. The only light was the faint, eerie green glow of the emergency exit sign at the far end of the hall. Silence. A profound, absolute silence that was more shocking than any noise. The building, usually a living thing with its own hums and sighs, was suddenly a corpse. My heart started to pound, a frantic drum in the sudden quiet. I was in the sub-basement, a labyrinth of concrete and steel, plunged into near-total darkness. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pricked at the base of my skull. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, but of course, I'd left it charging on a shelf across the room. I was trapped. Just as a genuine wave of panic was about to crest, a beam of light cut through the darkness from the hallway. It swept across the walls of my office before landing squarely on my face. I flinched, throwing a hand up to shield my eyes. "Leo? You in there?" Julian's voice. Calm. Steady. A lifeline thrown into the dark. "Yes," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm here." The door opened, and he stepped inside, the powerful beam of his flashlight preceding him. He played the light around the small office, checking the corners as if expecting to find a monster lurking in the shadows. Then he brought the beam back to me. His face, illuminated from below by the flashlight he held, was a study in shadows and planes. He looked serious, focused. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Just startled. Whole grid went down on this side of the city," he explained, his voice a low rumble that was immensely reassuring in the oppressive silence. "Backup generator for the main systems kicked in, but the auxiliary power for the offices is shot. We'll have to walk you out." The word hung in the air. He wasn't just going to point me toward the exit. He was going to take me. He moved further into the office, the beam of his flashlight dancing over the shelves. "Grab your coat. Anything you can't leave overnight." I shook my head, my mind still fuzzy. "No, everything's backed up. I just need my bag." He held the light steady while I fumbled for my messenger bag and shrugged on my jacket. The simple act of getting ready to leave felt strange, disjointed in the dark. My movements were clumsy, uncertain. When I was ready, I stood there, waiting for his instruction. "All right," he said. "Stick close to me. Some of the emergency lights are out in the service corridors. It's tricky." He turned, and I followed him out into the pitch-black hallway. The darkness was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to press in from all sides. The only reality was the bouncing circle of light from Julian's flashlight and the sound of our footsteps on the concrete floor. He kept the pace slow, methodical, sweeping the light ahead of us. I stayed right behind him, my eyes fixed on the broad expanse of his back. The scent of his cologne was stronger in the enclosed space, a comforting anchor in the disorienting dark. We navigated the winding service corridors, a part of the building I rarely saw, a maze of pipes and conduit. At one point, we came to a junction, and he paused. "This way," he said, and he reached back, his hand finding my arm. His grip was firm, his fingers warm through the fabric of my jacket. "There's a patch of water on the floor here. Don't want you to slip." My entire nervous system lit up. His hand on my arm wasn't accidental. It wasn't ambiguous. It was a deliberate, protective gesture. He guided me around the puddle, his hand never leaving my arm. My mind, usually a whirlwind of overanalysis, went completely quiet. All I could feel was the solid, reassuring pressure of his hand, the warmth of his body so close to mine. It was the most profound sense of safety I had felt in years. We walked the rest of the way in silence, his hand remaining on my arm. The shared experience, the vulnerability of the darkness, had stripped away all pretense. There was no glass wall between us anymore. There was no professional distance. There was just the two of us, moving as one through the dark. When we finally emerged into the main lobby, which was bathed in the dim, humming glow of the backup generators, he let go of my arm. The loss of contact was immediate and sharp. I felt suddenly cold, exposed. The vast, empty space of the rotunda, usually so grand, felt lonely and intimidating. "The main doors are on lockdown," he said, his voice back to its usual professional calm, though it seemed a bit strained. "We'll have to go out through the loading dock." He led me toward a heavy steel door I had never been through. As he keyed in a code, the silence between us stretched, no longer comfortable, but charged with everything that had just passed between us in the dark. He glanced over his shoulder at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You ever think about working in the day?" he asked, the question so out of the blue it took me by surprise. I blinked. "What?" "On the day shift," he clarified, turning back to the keypad. "With the sun and other people." It was the most personal question he had ever asked me. It was a glimpse past the stoic facade, a moment of genuine curiosity, a moment of softness. He wasn't just Julian the Watchman anymore. He was a man wondering about my life, my choices. I like the quiet, I said, the answer feeling inadequate, incomplete. The collections are more peaceful at night. What I wanted to say was, I work at night because I'm hiding. From the sun. From other people. From myself. But the words wouldn't come. The lock buzzed, and he pushed the heavy door open, revealing the cavernous, rain-slicked space of the loading dock. The storm had lessened to a drizzle, and the air was cold and smelled of wet concrete and diesel fumes. He stood aside to let me pass, and as I walked by, our shoulders brushed. This time, I knew it wasn't an accident. It was a confirmation. Something had shifted between us tonight. The foundation had cracked, and through that crack, something new and fragile was beginning to grow. And as I stepped out into the damp night air, I felt a terrifying, exhilarating flicker of hope. The quiet was no longer what I wanted. The weeks following the power outage were defined by a new, palpable tension. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by a shared awareness that simmered just below the surface of our nightly interactions. The casual leaning against the doorframe was now charged with intent. The glances held for a fraction of a second longer, heavy with unspoken questions. The space between us felt electric, a magnetic field that both drew us in and kept us apart. We were circling each other, caught in a gravitational pull that was becoming impossible to resist. The subtext of our conversations became the main text. We talked about work, about the weather, about nothing at all, but what we were really talking about was us. The tipping point came on a Thursday. It arrived in the form of Mark, a day-shift research assistant I actively disliked. Mark was loud, condescending, and possessed a brand of casual cruelty he mistook for humor. I had been forced to stay late to finish an urgent intake report, which meant my schedule overlapped with the end of his. He swaggered into my office just as I was packing up, a full hour before Julian's shift even started. "Burning the midnight oil, Leo?" he asked, his voice dripping with false bonhomie. He perched on the corner of my desk, invading my personal space. "Or just avoiding the sunlight? Can't say I blame you. Must be hard to find a good goth club these days." I felt a hot flush of anger and shame creep up my neck. His comments were always like this, veiled, snide digs at my quiet nature, my solitary job, and what he clearly assumed was my sexuality. I never rose to the bait. I just wanted him to leave. "Just finishing a report, Mark," I said, my voice tight. Right. All your little boxes and dusty papers," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Whatever floats your boat, I guess. Some guys are into that quiet, sensitive type." He winked, a gesture so slimy it made my skin crawl. "Don't worry, your secret's safe with me." Before I could formulate a response, a low voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" We both turned. Julian was standing in the doorway, already in uniform. He must have come in early. He wasn't leaning. He was standing straight, his arms crossed over his chest, his presence filling the entire frame. His face was like stone, his eyes fixed on Mark with an intensity that was glacial. He looked dangerous. Mark, for the first time, looked flustered. He slid off my desk, his bravado evaporating. No problem, Julian. Just chatting with Leo. Team building." Julian's gaze didn't waver. He didn't say a word. He just stared, a silent, immovable force. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Mark's smarmy smile faltered. He cleared his throat, grabbing his bag. "Well, I'm out of here," he said, his voice suddenly high-pitched. "Long day. See you, Leo." He practically scurried out of the office, refusing to make eye contact with Julian as he passed. The moment he was gone, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, but the air was still charged, vibrating with the aftershock of the confrontation. Julian uncrossed his arms, the tension leaving his shoulders. He stepped into the office, his eyes finally moving from the empty hallway to me. His expression was no longer cold, but it was deeply serious, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and rough. I could only nod, my throat tight with a complicated mix of gratitude and humiliation. I felt exposed, seen in a way I never wanted to be. He took another step closer, his gaze searching my face. "Does that happen a lot?" The question was quiet, but it was loaded. He wasn't just asking about Mark. He was asking about my life, about the things I endured in silence. He was seeing the shadows I tried so hard to hide in. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I couldn't look at him. I stared at a random box on a shelf, focusing on the neat, black stenciled letters. He was silent for a long moment. I could feel his presence, his stillness. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne. I braced myself for pity, for an awkward platitude. Instead, what came was something else entirely. "No one should talk to you like that," he said, and the simple, declarative statement was filled with a protective fury that stunned me. It wasn't pity. It was anger. On my behalf. I finally forced myself to meet his eyes. The unreadable expression was gone. In its place was something raw and open, a fierce loyalty that took my breath away. In that moment, I saw it. I saw everything. The lingering glances, the small touches, the quiet attention. It all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. He cared about me. The realization was so overwhelming, so powerful, it felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. "Thank you," I said, the words feeling small and inadequate for the enormity of what I felt. He just gave a short, sharp nod, as if to say it wasn't necessary. "Finish packing up," he said, his voice returning to a semblance of its usual calm, but the undercurrent was still there. "I'll walk you out." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a promise. As I gathered my things, my hands shaking slightly, I knew that everything had changed. The slow burn had finally reached the flashpoint. The quiet circling was over. Tonight, something had to break. The tension had become a living thing between us, and it was no longer possible to ignore it. The loaded interaction had ended, and a confrontation, of one kind or another, was now inevitable. The walk from my sub-basement office to the loading dock was the longest of my life. The air between us was thick with everything that had been said, and, more importantly, everything that hadn't. Julian didn't speak, and I couldn't have formed a coherent sentence if my life depended on it. My mind was a chaotic storm of fear and hope. The memory of his cold fury directed at Mark, and the subsequent raw concern in his eyes when he looked at me, played on a loop. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing to have been defended like that, to be seen like that. We moved through the familiar, echoing corridors, our footsteps the only sound. It was different from our walk in the dark during the power outage. Then, the darkness had provided a cover for our proximity. Now, under the steady, humming lights, there was nowhere to hide. Every brush of our arms as we walked, every shared glance in the reflection of a glass display case, was magnified, amplified. I was acutely aware of his physical presence beside me, a solid, warm reality that made my own body feel light, untethered. He walked with a purpose I hadn't seen before, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He was leading us towards something, and I was following, my heart a frantic, panicked drum against my ribs. We reached the heavy steel door to the loading dock. He keyed in the code, the series of beeps loud in the silence. The lock buzzed, a harsh, electric sound that seemed to signal a point of no return. He pushed the door open, and a rush of cold, damp night air washed over us. The vast, cavernous space was lit by a few harsh sodium lamps, casting long, distorted shadows. A single truck was parked at the far end, its engine idling with a low rumble. Otherwise, the dock was deserted. It felt like a stage, set for a final act. My car was parked in its usual spot, just beyond the edge of the concrete platform. All I had to do was walk to it, say goodnight, drive away, pretend that tonight was just another night. But I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the spot. My throat was dry. This is it. The moment slips away. He'll say goodnight, and you'll go, and tomorrow you'll be back to analyzing his glances and overthinking his tone. The thought was unbearable. Julian turned to me, his back to the open dock. His face was half in shadow, half in the sickly yellow light. His expression was intense, searching. "Leo," he started, his voice low and rough. He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "This is it. My heart is a frantic bird against my ribs. I can't breathe. The air is too thick. He's going to say something, something that will either shatter me or put me back together." The silence stretches, a taut wire between us. I see the muscle in his jaw clench. He's as lost as I am. And in that moment of shared, agonizing uncertainty, something inside me breaks. The fear, The years of quiet yearning, the sudden, fierce hope, it all spills over. I don't think I can just say goodnight tonight. I hear myself say, the words a hoarse whisper. My own voice sounds foreign to me, reckless and desperate. Julian's eyes widen almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something, surprise, relief, crosses his face. He takes a half-step closer, and the world seems to shrink to the few inches of space between our bodies. He lifts a hand, slowly, deliberately, and his fingers brush against my jaw. His touch is hesitant at first, then firm, his thumb stroking gently over the line of my cheekbone. The gesture is so tender, so incredibly gentle, it undoes me. My eyes burn with unshed tears. Good, he says, his voice a gravelly murmur that vibrates through my entire being. Because I don't want you to. He doesn't lunge. He doesn't grab. He simply closes the remaining distance between us, his other hand coming up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. He tips my head back slightly, his dark eyes searching mine for a final confirmation, a final consent. I give a small, shaky nod. And then he kisses me. It's not a kiss of frantic passion or desperate release. It is quiet, and it is deep. It is a question and an answer all at once. His lips are firm and warm, moving against mine with a sureness that belies the hesitation I saw in his eyes moments before. It's a kiss that speaks of long-held restraint, of nights spent watching and waiting. It tastes of coffee and sandalwood and the cold night air. It feels like coming home. I press into him, my hands coming up to grip the front of his uniform, fisting the thick, sturdy fabric as if to anchor myself. He makes a low sound in the back of his throat, a sound of pure affirmation, and deepens the kiss. His arm wraps around my waist, pulling me flush against his body. I can feel the solid wall of his chest, the steady, heavy beat of his heart against mine. It's not frantic like my own. It's a slow, powerful rhythm. A constant. This is real. This is happening. The thought is a flare of light in my mind. The stoic protector, the silent guardian of my nights, is kissing me in a shadowy corner of a deserted loading dock. The years of loneliness, of feeling like a ghost in my own life, seem to fall away, replaced by the staggering, overwhelming reality of his mouth on mine, his hands on my body. He pulls back slightly, just enough to rest his forehead against mine. We're both breathing heavily, our breath mingling in the cold air. I keep my eyes closed, afraid that if I open them, he'll disappear. His thumb strokes the sensitive skin behind my ear, a slow, soothing motion. Leo, he whispers, and the sound of my name on his lips is the most intimate thing I have ever heard. I open my eyes. He's looking at me, his face open and vulnerable in a way I never thought I'd see. The guard is down. The walls are gone. There is no more ambiguity, no more subtext. There is only the honest, undeniable truth between us. I've wanted to do that, he says, his voice thick with emotion, for a very long time. A laugh, shaky and wet, escapes my lips. Me too. I confess, the admission feeling like the easiest, most natural thing in the world. He smiles then. Not the ghost of a smile I had caught so rarely, but a full, genuine smile that lights up his entire face. It's devastating. It's the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. He leans in and kisses me again, and this time it's not a question. It's a statement. It's a beginning. In the cold, industrial emptiness of the loading dock, under the hum of the yellow lights, everything was finally starting. I drove home in a daze, my lips still tingling, the scent of him clinging to my clothes. The familiar streets of the sleeping city looked different, sharper, more vibrant. The world had been muted, and that kiss had turned the color back on. I replayed the entire night in my head, but my mind kept snagging on that single, perfect moment. His forehead against mine, his voice a low whisper, the quiet confession that mirrored my own. I touched my lips, half convinced I had imagined it all. But the feeling was real. The warmth was real. When I finally got to my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the dark, looking out the window at the city lights, and for the first time, I didn't feel separate from them. I felt like a part of the living, breathing world. The profound loneliness that had been my constant companion for years was gone, replaced by a fragile, fluttering hope that was so intense it was almost painful. I fell asleep fully clothed, and my dreams were a jumble of dark corridors, the scent of sandalwood, and the feeling of a warm, steady hand on my arm. The next morning, or rather, later that same morning, I woke to the jarring sound of my alarm. Sunlight was streaming through a gap in the curtains, a brutal intrusion after a night spent in shadows. My first thought was of Julian. My second thought was a cold, sharp spike of panic. What now? My mind, my cruel, over-analytic mind, immediately started to spin. It was a kiss. Just a kiss. It happened late at night, under duress, after an emotional confrontation. Maybe it was a mistake. A moment of impulse he now regrets. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The euphoria of the night before evaporated, leaving behind the bitter dregs of anxiety. The day stretched before me, an agonizing expanse of time until my shift. I went through the motions, showering, making coffee, trying to eat, but my body felt disconnected from my mind. I was a ghost again, haunting my own apartment, waiting for the night. The fear of his regret was a knot in my stomach. What if I got to work and he wasn't there? What if he was there, but he was different, distant, professional? What if he acted like it never happened? The idea of returning to the old routine, the polite nods and professional distance, after what had passed between us, was unbearable. When I arrived at the museum that evening, the building felt different. The familiar quiet now seemed charged with expectation. My hands were clammy as I keyed in my code and made my way down to the sub-basement. My office, my sanctuary of solitude, felt like a cage. I sat at my desk, the computer screen glowing, but I couldn't work. I just stared at the security monitor that showed the main security console, waiting for him to appear. The hours crawled by. 9 p.m., 10 p.m. His shift started at 11. At 10:55, I saw movement on the screen. It was him. He was setting his thermos down on the desk, shrugging off his jacket. My heart hammered against my ribs. He looked the same steady movements, the same calm demeanor. I couldn't read anything from his posture on the grainy screen. I spent the next few hours in a state of suspended animation, my anxiety mounting with every passing minute. Our old routine had him checking on me at 3:42 a.m. Would he still come? Would he avoid me? At 1:30 a.m., long before our appointed time, I heard footsteps in the hall. Not the slow, measured pace of his rounds, but quick, purposeful steps. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath. The door opened without a knock. Julian stood there, a paper cup of coffee in his hand. He wasn't smiling. His face was serious, his eyes searching mine. The silence stretched for a beat, thick with a terrible, awkward tension. The morning after unease I had dreaded was here, a palpable thing between us. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. He walked over to my desk and placed the coffee cup down beside my keyboard. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his gaze intense. "I couldn't wait," he said finally, his voice low and quiet. I stared at him, my mind blank with confusion and relief. "Wait for what?" "To see you," he said. "I woke up this morning, and I was afraid you'd think last night was—" He trailed off, searching for the word. "A mistake." The knot in my stomach dissolved so quickly it left me feeling dizzy. He had been feeling the same thing. The same fear. The same uncertainty. He had been as worried as I was. I confessed, my voice barely a whisper. "I was terrified you regretted it." A look of profound relief washed over his face. He reached out, his hand covering mine where it rested on the desk. His touch was warm, solid, and completely deliberate. There was no ambiguity now. He laced his fingers through mine, a simple, profound gesture of connection. "Never," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. "Leo, I haven't been able to think about anything else." He squeezed my hand. I woke up feeling right, for the first time in a long time. The simple honesty of his words broke through the last of my fear. This was real. This was happening. It wasn't a fleeting moment on a loading dock. It was here, now, in the sterile light of my office, with his hand holding mine. The reassurance I had desperately craved was more solid and real than I could have imagined. We sat there for a long moment in a comfortable silence, our hands clasped together on the desk, a silent testament to the new bond between us. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady intimacy. He had knocked on my door, not as a watchman, but as a man who was afraid of losing something he had only just found. And in doing so, he had secured it completely. Our new beginning wasn't a grand, cinematic declaration. It was a series of quiet moments, of small, deliberate choices that wove our separate lives together. The nightly check-ins continued, but they were different now. He would come into my office and close the door, and the small, sterile space would transform into our private world. He would sit on the edge of my desk while I worked, his presence a warm, comforting weight. We talked. We really talked. I told him about my family, about why I'd chosen a life surrounded by the past. I told him about the loneliness, the feeling of being an observer. He listened, his dark eyes never leaving my face, his stillness making me feel heard in a way I never had been. In return, he shared pieces of himself. He told me about his time in the army, about the quiet restlessness that had followed him home. He told me he took the night watchman job because the silence helped him think, but that lately, the silence had started to feel empty. He spoke of a past relationship that had ended badly, leaving him wary and guarded. As he spoke, I saw the man behind the stoic facade, a man who was just as cautious, just as hungry for connection as I was. We were two solitary people who had found a shared orbit. The end-of-shift walk to the loading dock became our ritual. But now, the moment we were out of sight of the main corridor cameras, his hand would find mine. Lacing our fingers together felt as natural as breathing. The first time he did it, a jolt of pure, unadulterated joy shot through me. It was such a simple, public and private gesture, a declaration that we were something more. We would stand in the shadows of the loading dock, the place of our first kiss, and we would talk, our voices low. Sometimes he would press me against the cold brick wall and kiss me, slow and deep, a reminder of what we were, a promise of what we could be. Those kisses were a reclamation of the space, turning a cold, industrial area into something sacred in ours. The test of our new connection came, as I knew it would, from the outside world. Mark, predictably, noticed the change. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he could sense the shift in the atmosphere. He saw me smiling more. He saw a confidence in me that hadn't been there before. One day, he saw Julian drop a coffee off on my desk during the shift change, a gesture that was, on the surface, innocuous. But Mark's eyes narrowed, his small, cruel mind working. Getting cozy with the night staff, are we? He sneered later when we were alone. Guess the big, silent type is your thing after all. A year ago, a month ago, his words would have sent a spike of shame and fear through me. I would have shrunk, deflected, wished myself invisible. But this time was different. I thought of Julian's hand in mine. I thought of his low, rumbling laugh. I thought of the fierce, protective anger in his eyes when he had defended me. I felt a surge of strength, a quiet confidence that was entirely new. I stopped what I was doing and looked Mark directly in the eye. I didn't say anything. I just held his gaze, my expression calm. I channeled Julian's stillness, his immovable presence. Mark's smirk faltered under my steady, silent scrutiny. He was used to me flinching, not to me meeting his gaze head-on. He shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable. Whatever, he muttered, turning away. Just saying. He walked away, and I felt a profound sense of victory. I hadn't needed Julian to protect me this time. The strength he had given me, the confidence that came from being seen and valued, was now a part of me. I had protected myself. When I told Julian about it that night, a slow, proud smile spread across his face. He reached out and cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. Good, he said, his voice thick with pride. That's good, Leo. We were building a life in the quiet hours, in the stolen moments and shared silences. The museum, once a symbol of my isolation, had become the backdrop for our love story. But the job that had brought us together was also a constraint. Our world existed between the hours of 11 p.m. and 7 a.m., within the climate-controlled walls of the archive. The question of the outside world, of daylight and normalcy, hung in the air, unspoken. One night, as we stood on the loading dock before I left, Julian was quieter than usual. He held my hand, his thumb rubbing slow circles over my knuckles. The single truck that was usually idling was gone, and the silence was deep and complete. I was thinking, he said, his gaze on the distant city lights. This is good. Us. Here. He paused, then turned to look at me, his expression serious. But I want more than this. My heart skipped a beat. More. I want to see you in the sunlight, he said, his voice soft. I want to have breakfast with you. I want to take you to a movie. I want to see what you look like when you're not surrounded by old paper and fluorescent lights. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, solitary key on a simple metal ring. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. It was warm from his body. This is to my place. It's not much, but it's quiet. He gave me a small, self-deprecating smile. You'd probably like it. I stared at the key in my hand. It was a simple object, a piece of cut metal, but it felt as heavy and significant as a planet. It was an offer, a conscious choice. It was a key to a future, to a life beyond the walls of the museum. It was everything I had been too afraid to even hope for. Tears welled in my eyes, and this time, I didn't fight them. I let them fall. Julian, I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. He wiped a tear from my cheek with his thumb, his touch infinitely gentle. You don't have to, he said quickly. There's no pressure. I just wanted you to have it. I want you to know you can. I shook my head, a wet, choked laugh escaping me. I surged forward, wrapping my arms around his neck and kissing him with everything I had. It was a kiss of gratitude, of overwhelming love, of a future I could suddenly see so clearly. He held me tight, his arms a strong, safe harbor around me. The next Saturday, I used the key. I walked up to the plain brown door of his apartment, my heart pounding, and let myself in. The apartment was sparse, clean, and filled with sunlight. It smelled like him. He was in the kitchen, making coffee, and when he saw me standing in his living room, bathed in the morning light, he broke into that rare, beautiful, devastating smile. Hey, he said, his voice soft. You came. I came home. I replied, and the words felt truer than anything I had ever said. We spent the day together and the night. For the first time, we slept in the same bed, not out of exhaustion, but out of choice. Lying there in the dark, his arm around me, his slow, steady breathing a rhythm against my back, I felt a sense of peace that was absolute. The quiet I had once used to hide from the world was now something different. It was a shared silence, filled not with loneliness, but with presence. With him. My life was no longer a study in stillness. It was a study in connection. The ghost on the security monitor had become the man sleeping beside me. The silent observer had become an active participant in his own life, in our life. I had spent so long cataloging the past, and now, I finally had a future to look forward to. Lying there in the quiet intimacy of his bedroom, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest, I knew my internal journey was complete. I was no longer isolated. I was no longer afraid. I was loved. And that was a discovery more precious than any artifact in the archives. It was the beginning of everything.